Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Quincy Adams, and the focus is Secretary of State, Part 1. The year is 1817, and the Virginia dynasty continues in the presidency of the United States, from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, and now James Monroe, the fifth man to hold that office. And one of the first things he had to do was to form a cabinet, and he had a pretty strong group. He went south to get William Crawford as his Secretary of the Treasury. He's from Georgia. You've got South Carolina's John Calhoun stepping in as Secretary of War. William Wirt from Virginia becomes the Attorney General, and then up north to Massachusetts for the last two members of the team. Benjamin Crowninshield is the Secretary of the Navy, and John Quincy Adams is Secretary of State. Seems like Adams has been in the foreign service of his country since his teenage years, and now he's almost 50. He's risen to the top of the diplomatic corps, in the cabinet, Secretary of State, and a chance to really make a difference as the top advisor to James Monroe throughout most of that presidency. In fact, he stays for all 8 years. It was not an easy job. The State Department not only had responsibilities for all foreign policy, but also had some domestic responsibilities at the time, and the entire department was basically a secretary, John Quincy Adams, and 5 clerks. There was a lot of work to do. Fortunately, Adams was a workaholic, so he worked around the clock, but this was a very demanding position. And he didn't just weigh in on foreign policy. The way Monroe ran the cabinet is all the major issues. He brought all of the cabinet members together. They talked it out as a team. And of course, Monroe would make that final decision. But it wasn't just isolating Adams in the world of foreign policy alone. Now, this was a rare moment in time. It was called the era of good feelings because partisan strife had effectively gone away. The Federalist Party, the opposition to the Monroe Democratic Republicans, had disintegrated, particularly in the War of 1812, which they strongly opposed. And in the end, most of the American people supported the outcome of the war, made the Federalists look terrible, and so there was no political opposition. Party rancor was kind of gone, and it was very unusual and something that John Quincy Adams was really happy about. He said, "Party spirit has indeed subsided throughout the Union to a degree that I should have thought scarcely possible. The general prosperity of our country and the contentment which pervades every part of it are delightful to the patriotic feelings of an American, and most especially of an American arriving from Europe." Nevertheless, challenges did exist. And in foreign policy was one of these areas. In fact, it was a combination domestic and foreign policy issue that caused some of the early strife for the administration to deal with. On the southern border of the United States, there were renegade Indian tribes that were hiding out, if you will, in Spanish-held Florida, but having incursions against Americans in the southern part of the United States, particularly in the areas around Georgia. And the administration said, enough's enough. We can't have this anymore. They were upset at Spain because it was Spain's treaty responsibilities to police their own territory, not give safe harbor to these renegade Indians, but they weren't doing that job. So Secretary of War Calhoun gave the orders to General Edmund Gaines that he was to capture these Indians, stop these depredations that they were performing on American citizens, and if they had to go into Spanish-held Florida to do it, he had permission to do so. But there was an important caveat. Don't engage the Spanish. We are not at war with the Spanish, he was told. So if the Indians try to gain cover or hide out in Spanish-held towns or forts, don't attack. Ask for more information for permission on what to do from headquarters here in Washington. But other than that, you can go into Florida to go after the Indians. Well, General Gaines actually was already on another assignment, and so the task went to a different major general, one by the name of Andrew Jackson. Jackson embraced this opportunity. He pulled his men together. He had the same orders with the same caveats, but he handled things a little differently, as Andrew Jackson was wont to do. He went in, he certainly destroyed every remnant of these Indian tribes, killing, maiming, destroying towns, and that was all within his charter. But he did a couple of other things. He captured a couple of British citizens along the way that he claimed were aiding and abetting the enemy. He caught them, he tried them, he executed them. He also came upon a Spanish fort, St. Mark's, and another large Spanish town, Pensacola, that he said were also supporting the enemy. So he gave a warning. He was told, look, we're not at war with you Americans. Don't attack us. And he couldn't care less. He did attack both, he captured both, and he felt his job was done. The Indian problem was suppressed, and he had no qualms at all about what he did with the Spanish or those 2 British citizens. Sent his report back to the Washington, D.C., and there was an uproar, not surprisingly, because Jackson had essentially committed acts of war against Spain for sure, and most likely against Britain as well, far exceeding his authority that he had been given in those orders from Secretary Calhoun. There was only one person in the Monroe cabinet that actually supported Jackson, and that was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Adams said, "The president and all the members of the cabinet, except myself, are of opinion that Jackson acted not only without but against his instructions, that he had committed war against Spain. The question is embarrassing and complicated, not only as involving an actual war with Spain, but that of the executive power to authorize hostilities without a declaration of war by Congress." So not only were they worried about the implications with these foreign powers that Jackson had attacked their citizens and their towns in the case of Spain, but he did so without any declaration of war by Congress. So there were all kinds of constitutional concerns. Congress was up in arms. So the president had to decide what to do. Well, first of all, he said, we've got to make things right as best we can with Spain and Britain. Quincy Adams, that's your responsibility as Secretary of State. James Monroe tried to settle things with Jackson, which we had covered actually in an earlier episode and won't belabor here. For John Quincy Adams' job, this was a challenging spot for him because, again, he actually didn't think that Jackson did anything wrong, but he saluted his commander-in-chief and said, yes, I'll take care of it. So he went and talked to the British. Fortunately, he was able to calm the British down. The British and the Americans were actually getting along pretty well. The War of 1812 was over. Their trade was getting back to normal. And so they were willing to put this aside, these 2 executions aside, for the greater good of the relationship. Spain was a little more complicated, but Adams took a strong stand. He said, look, we're giving you St. Mark's, we're giving you Pensacola back, we're taking our military out of the area, but you guys let this happen. And if you're not going to police your territory and we have to come in again, we may not give your territory back the next time. So they were on notice. And it actually brought Spain to the table to help the Americans finally acquire East and West Florida, something that they've been trying to do for decades. And John Quincy Adams was on point for this next level of negotiations. He was joined by Luis de Onís, the minister to the United States from Spain, and they worked out an agreement that actually both sides gave a little bit to get what they wanted. The Americans got the Floridas. The Americans were willing to put forward $5 million to cover claims against Spain by American citizens, but the Americans gave up some of the western part of Louisiana Territory. There was a disputed section between the Sabina River and the Rio Grande, and that territory was basically the territory of Texas. There was confusion, or at least dispute about what the Louisiana Purchase authorized, and the Americans were willing to cede that dispute to the Spanish and only take American territory as far west as the Sabina River. Texas would stay with Spain. The last piece, though, is part of this agreement because what we now see as the southwest part of the United States, all of that was Spanish territory at the time. There was an agreement to draw a line all the way to the Pacific Ocean that was now demarking where American territory stopped and Spanish territory started again. This was a big accomplishment for John Quincy Adams. He said, perhaps the most important day of my life. The acquisition of the Floridas has long been an object of earnest desire in this country. The acknowledgement of a definite line of boundary to the South Sea, the Pacific Ocean, forms a great epoch in our history. The first proposal of it in this negotiation was my own, and I trust it is now secured beyond the reach of revocation. Quincy Adams was really pleased with this outcome. At the same time, though, he had a personal loss. He lost his mother, Abigail Adams, who had been so important in raising him and giving him a lot of the values that, sure, he got a lot from his father, John Adams, he got a lot from his mother, Abigail Adams, as well. And he said at the passing that this is one of the most severest afflictions to which human existence is liable. The silver cord is broken. At once silent and active as the movement of the orbs of heaven, one of the links which connected me with former ages is no more. His father would live still several more years, but Abigail Adams was gone in 1818 at the age of 73. John Quincy Adams, we've mentioned in previous episodes, every once in a while picks up new habits and that he was an exercise enthusiast. Well, somebody suggested, why don't you try swimming? And so what he did was he went down to the Potomac River, took off all his clothes, went swimming, and he liked it quite a bit. So for the next 30 years, wandering around the Potomac River, anybody could look in, and at any given time, you might see John Quincy Adams, including when he was President of the United States, swimming naked in the Potomac River, just another quirky habit of John Quincy Adams. Well, at the end of the first term for the Monroe administration, there was one more ancillary task for Adams to perform in his role as Secretary of State. One of those domestic duties was tied to one of his other hobbies that he had picked up along the way. It was near and dear to his heart. It was a report on weights and measures, those standards that he started studying so much when he was the minister to Russia. He took on this responsibility with gusto and tried to put together a report that would really answer this question of how do we have standard weights and measures not only in the United States, but in trade as well. He said about his report to Congress that this subject has occupied for the last 60 years many of the ablest men in Europe. And to it all the powers and all the philosophical and mathematical learning and ingenuity of France and Great Britain have been incessantly directed. It was a fearful and oppressive task. It has been executed, and it will be for the public to judgment to pass upon it. Well, what did the public think? The few people who read it and cared about it thought it was a pretty good job. But nobody really cared. This was not a big deal. It was a big deal to him. It would be a big deal as eventually these standards would be established. He was praised for his report for the handful of people who cared, but frankly, most didn't really care. Well, at this stage, the era of good feelings was essentially ending. Slavery was starting to emerge again from its temporary slumber as the major political cleavage across the United States. All politics was about to change as things were carrying toward the end of the first Monroe term in office. But that's all the story for another day. That is John Quincy Adams and Secretary of State Part 1 from the life of John Quincy Adams. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.